While the chatter on information warfare typically centers around ideas of propaganda or something that people refer to as fifth generation warfare, or the ideological warfare that might take place in the world, it very rarely reaches into the practical for individuals like you and I. The focus on this idea of information as a tool for creating and resolving conflicts doesn't or is so oftentimes focused on this sort of mythical propagandist idea. It's not exactly mythical, but it's so focused on some sort of top-down authoritarianism. You read books like 1984, Brave New World, Atlas Shrugged. This idea that information warfare is about speaking about narratives. But when you're on the ground and when you're engaging in the 21st century, our post-information age world, we have so much more to deal with when it comes to practicality. It's not so much that we are engaged in the narratives of what's going on. In fact, it doesn't really matter what their ideology is or how they mean to propagate it through, say, the academic system, when there are people marching down your street threatening to do violence upon you. And so in today's episode on the Redacted Culture Cast, we are going to talk about information warfare and tools that you can use for not only gathering information, but evaluating it and then disseminating it amongst your people. And I'm going to use some examples from 2020 and 2021 during the quote-unquote Summer of Love or the George Floyd Riots, where in the city of Minneapolis, very real threats were appearing often on the daily. And we on the ground had to figure out ways of not only gathering that information, but evaluating it and then spreading it to the right people. So, before we get started, this episode has been sponsored by none other than Obsidian Arms. If you've been listening for a while, you've heard me talk about them a couple times, and I want to remind you that if you are looking to have or add some longevity to your workbench and your toolkits, give a look at what they have available. Obsidian Arms produces a series of punches as well as other toolkits for being useful on the workbench for building AR-15s or doing what we might call modern gunsmithing. And those tools come with a lifetime warranty. And so if you were to, say, wear out one, you can send it back to them and they will replace it for you. Obsidian Arms also provides the service of taking your idea and bringing it to life. They have the ability to manufacture multiple types of goods, particularly around the firearms industry is a good example, but they have quite a bit at their fingertips as far as Swiss machines and so on and so forth to take your idea and expand it in scale. So if you are either an entrepreneur or you're trying to start an idea and turn it into a product, or if you are looking for gunsmithing tools, head over to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. So information warfare. What do we mean, or what do I mean when I'm talking about information warfare in this case? Generally speaking, as I talked about in the introduction, information warfare is usually spoke about on the narrative level. This is where you're getting propaganda or the news or controlled narratives. But what I want to do for this episode is shift our perspective away from, say, governments themselves or the agendas behind hidden doors with tech companies and so on and so forth, and start looking at what happens when you're in the middle of a riot that has been going on for days and you need to start evaluating information regarding potential threats to your life. How do you gather information when you are in the thick of it? Although it might sound conspiratorial, I doubt very many people were expecting what started with the death of one George Floyd to turn into a massive summer, and for some cities and states, years of violence in the streets, some of that continuing on to this day. But immediately, and I want to start with a little bit of how I perceived it and my story at that time, because if I recall right, George Floyd died on a Monday, but it was also, if I'm not mistaken, a Memorial Day Monday. And so the sleepiness of the world was all busy with our time off and our extra days of free time or whatever. We were away from work, perhaps enjoying something, barbecuing with the buds, or who cares, right? But Monday, that video came out of what happened there in now George Floyd Square, and then all of a sudden it was uncomfortable. The world felt like it was off, but we really didn't quite have a clear picture of it. And then I remember riding my motorcycle, and I was kind of riding around in the area where it was nearby, and I noticed that a building had been burned. And so like a couple days go by, and pretty soon, the momentum expands. There's riots in the streets, protests are going on. We're seeing more things lit on fire. And then all of a sudden, I believe it was the Thursday, it might have been the Wednesday though, where the 3rd precinct is on fire. And so my wife and I got on our motorcycle and we brought a camera out and we took some pictures to see what was going on, to really kind of see what was going on in that environment. And there was a great mix of people. Buildings were on fire. There was an electrical concern about Minnehaha Liquors. People were looting a gas station, and they were looting, well, the Target and the big box stores in the area, and that the kind of bedlam had already taken place. It had this kind of weird feeling between the like a festival and chaos. And so we saw what we saw, and the world changed pretty quickly for us. Now, at that time though, this is early on in the whole COVID experience, and the world was very, we were all in our homes. We were all kind of glued to our screens, even worse than we are on a normal day-to-day life, because we were supposedly not going out of our homes. But of course, it was acceptable for people to be in immediate proximity to one another, so long as they're burning down your local Wendy's. I guess that's kind of the joke these days. So let's go on. And as the riots and the violence progressed, you started seeing social media was lit up with stories of things that were happening or concerns. Like there was this, I remember one distinctly coming across social media, it was Twitter at the time, was saying that the white supremacists are marching down from this area and they're going to come into this area and do the bad thing. Turns out that never happened and it never existed, but that was the thing. That was the story. That was the fear that was spreading through social media like wildfire. And a group of us had gotten together at this time to basically look out after one another. We didn't all live in the same neighborhood, but we invited a whole bunch of people together to talk about what people might need. Are there certain issues about their vulnerabilities? How can we look after one another? I had lived in immediate proximity of a number of elderly people, and so that was also a concern of like, what are we doing as citizens and as men of our families to look out after our environment? And there was a problem at hand, and that was the amount of information that was streaming in through social media was so broad and so each one escalating its level of fear or intensity so quickly that we had to create a system on how to evaluate that information. So gathering information during a time like a riot can range everywhere from the news to boots on the ground, or just having people out there looking out, people knowing where they're at, building a map using something like Google Maps or something like ITAC or ATAC to build a map and key points of interest where people are, maybe where the police stations are, where the National Guard's bases are, where key grocery stores might be, or food locations, key routes of travel, whether it's foot or by vehicle. The city of Minneapolis is split by a river, so how many bridges are there and where are they located? Are they vehicle bridges or are they foot bridges, and so on and so forth. And so the group of men that got together, we talked for a while on just what people might need, whether it's resources, food, water, and so on and so forth, or how their families are doing and what's going on from there. But we developed a system, or not even really developed, we quickly established a system of communication amongst ourselves, and we used an app like Signal or like Telegram, which has some semblance of encryption, so it's a little bit more difficult to break into. But we used an app like Signal, like Telegram, where we could build a specific chat group, like open up a thread, so to speak. And we opened up two of them. One of them we called the red line, and one of them we called the black line. And the black line was for like indiscriminate chatter. That would be if somebody heard a rumor that something was coming this way or this was happening. And I'll use some examples for that real quick. But if information that came in that might be pertinent to the group, then it would be posted there, so people could evaluate it and kind of discuss on whether it's likely, or even more importantly, for certain circumstances, to validate it. So if there was the concern that there was this group of people doing this kind of things, for example, when the Black Panthers appeared armed and aggressive on Snelling, which was a center street for the city, pretty much a main street. We were able to actually validate that was actually happening instead of just trusting in social media. And so the black line was for conversation regarding information pertinent to the situations that we were observing. The red line was exclusively for emergencies. And so one line was if something was posted in one line, then it was scuttlebutt. It was rumor. It was information in needing evaluation and needing verification. There needed to be in many ways. If there was a reasonable warning of a threat in an area, then the next step was to verify it through like someone had to go there and see it. And even if it was observing it from a distance, but to go and see it to verify that the issue was there to begin with. And so I'm going to break this down into three pieces: gathering information, evaluating information, and disseminating information, even though I've already told you how we spread it around, how we communicated with one another. So information that came in ranged from social media to eyewitness accounts to the rumors, somebody texting Mujahideen friends hidden in the work, or it came from mostly social media or things of that sort. Maybe we knew somebody who was in a position where they might have access to different information. We expanded our ability to draw in information through different people's personal networks. This wasn't social networking. This was just, we knew these people. People knew each other. This person's brother was a police officer. This person was a police officer. Or this person was this or this or this or this. And so a nurse, a National Guardsman, a person who works in construction for infrastructure, everyone got to bring kind of their specialties to the information thing. Sources that were useless. The news. The news was completely useless because by the time it had anything to say, it was either too late or it was purely for the purpose of crafting a narrative. So while you would very easily discern the biases and the opinions of people on social media, you could still use the feed from someone like, was it Unicorn Riot or whatever. We could observe different forms of feeds, different methods or other people's chatter, whether it was this chat group amongst the Antifa guys or this thing over here that we could embed in, or we could observe, or even very oftentimes there were organizations, I think one of them was called Minnesota Uprising on social media, that was like the worst case of OPSEC ever. They had no filter on saying what was going on. And it was almost to the point of, I wonder if the person who was running that page was intentionally trying to jeopardize their success, because they were posting all of their plans and secrets in the public. Threats of violence, arguments of that sort, and whatnot. But we gathered information through Twitter, which would now be X, and through Instagram, and through human networks, people that we knew that lived. This guy lived in this part of town that had already seen a great amount of looting, and I would reach out to him every once in a while, and we'd take that information and we'd filter it all through the black line to have people verify certain pieces of information, whether or not they were credible threats or just yellow like concerns, but not real. But if somebody, and when somebody ended up posting something in the red line, it was an emergency, mobilize, and get to do it. And there was an example of this when we had, there was a time during the riots in Minneapolis where the police stations, this was a couple weeks in, or a couple days in, and the police stations outside, other than the 3rd Precinct, had hardened their targets, hardened their positions by setting up T-barricades or large cement walls and razor wire and so on and so forth, or concertina wire, whatever, so that it would make those targets more difficult to besiege, like the 3rd Precinct was besieged and ultimately lit on fire. And so what this did then is that if you follow the right pages through Instagram and social media and Twitter and so on and so forth, you would see people talk about what they were going to do then. And one of the concerns that was coming down the pipeline was that because the police stations couldn't be attacked, and because local businesses that were already kind of dealing with the looting issue or some other problems, because the commercial and the police station targets were no longer as attractive to the rioters, then as a result, they were threatening to go into residential areas. And someone that we knew had a family member in the danger zone of that area, and they had a young child. And so we moved them out. We went to go get them, take them to a safer place, someone else they could stay with that was outside of that red hot danger zone for a day or two to see whether or not it did happen. Turns out no one ended up burning down their local neighborhood, but there was a concern at that time. And so we could pass that information cleanly through the red line because it wasn't burdened with chatter. It wasn't. The red line was specifically for emergency, act now, we need to go. And so in that reflection, when we're talking about the evaluation of information, we're dealing with 2 types of issues here. One of them, and this goes back to the concept of information warfare, is because of things like the internet and social media and on-the-ground networks, we live in an age now where it is very reasonable to assume that if you find yourself in a hot zone, you might be flooded with more information than what's useful. If I live on the east side of town, at what point does it become irrelevant for me to know what's going on the west side of town if getting across that requires crossing a bridge that no one's doing because it's locked down by protesters? And so this ability to evaluate information we started with a big gathering mechanism, whether it was through social media or personal contacts and so on and so forth. But then we had to take that information and evaluate it. And one of the primary tools of evaluation that we used was individual verification. If there was a threat that, say, the bad people or a group of people who are described as being bad or threatening are coming from part of town A to part of town B, which is going to inevitably create a conflict. Let's say, think of them like 2 different gangs. If the gang in the north part of town is gathering together to go to the south part of town, which is inevitably going to create a conflict because the north and the south of this town are not getting along, metaphor understood, then it's important for us to be able to verify that movement is taking place before we scramble everybody to try to figure out what that needs to be done. But if somebody gets on the line and says, I have an emergency here, then we're not negotiating whether or not it's real. We're going to go there. We're going to take care of what needs to be taken care of, whether it's providing food or transportation or just a sense of I can't sleep or whatever because there's so much going on. And then we would be able to evaluate that information from there, disseminating it through multiple chains, primary being these apps, secondary being another form of social media, because you can use either a phone or a computer for that. And then the third one would have to be like person-to-person phone calls, networks, or even face-to-face communications. Now, during that riot, during that season of conflict, the phones did not go down for us. And so if we had lost the ability to communicate via phone or via internet, we would have been in trouble with how this information system would be used. There's gun culture, and of course many other people are, but there's a certain trend going on, and it's a good one, I think, where you're seeing a lot of citizens become interested in alternate forms of communication. Grid-based has been an influence for me on that one, and he has done a great job with it, but it's also helped illustrate the technological weaknesses in our communications platforms. However, if you've never used a radio before in a sort of military type capacity, there's an entire another piece to the coin, and that is, how do we communicate using this technology? For example, if if you receive a piece of information like, there's a credible threat against a building over here, how do you communicate that to your group? Because you're not all living together, you're not all in line of sight radio capable communication, so you have to develop different ways of talking. But how do I share that information with people in a meaningful way that is productive to their goals? Because if I'm going to blast a whole bunch of things out, like, okay, well, Twitter, this group and this violent group on Twitter is threatening to do this here, and this violent group is threatening to do this here, and these people are fighting here. That information is useful, particularly to the people in that area. It's not entertainment at this time, however. And so the evaluation, not the evaluations, and so learning to use a radio and learning to use even phones and app-based communications tools isn't just about the technological aspect of making it work. It's also, how do you effectively pass information from one person to another using said tools? So you might get something like a briefing, or every day there's a little a warning order, or just a summary of things going on. There was only a very short amount of time, like 2 days, where amongst this group of people that sort of rapidly organized to look out after the neighborhoods and one another, there's only a very short window, an extremely short window, where we had somebody monitoring different communications and information gathering mechanisms for 24 hours. You just kind of like, hey, this guy's on station for a while, and then this person would take over, and then this person would take over. That only happened for like 2 days. After about 2 days, we were entirely fine with having, not having 24-hour surveillance, but there was times where we were certainly capable of scaling up to that. There were times where we were very capable of scaling up the level of scaling up to 24-hour observation of different intel chains, whether it's through different social media platforms or through whatsoever. And so, but we didn't have to keep that up the whole time. Instead, then what became useful was passing that information on. So somebody would hear about a bit of information, going back to gathering. They would hear about it. They would acquire a piece of information about a certain potential event, and then somebody would verify it. And once it was verified, then we would spread it through the community and confirm it so that everyone who needed to know that information had access to it. And when you're talking about information warfare, one method of waging war on a people is to flood them with so much information that they cannot seem to evaluate effectively what's going on, that they spend all of their time at their keyboard arguing this and that over things that are not even real or even pertinent to the events going on, so that those who are operating in the dark or doing whatever they want to do can move with a relative amount of freedom of mobility, where they're unburdened by so many watching eyes, because so many of the people are completely distracted in the flood of information they are being given. And so we might want to talk about this idea of like tunnel vision, where when you're in a stress response situation to something bad happening, your vision gets tunneled, it gets focused, hyper focused on the potential threat. But that creates a series of physiological effects on the person, like auditory exclusion. We're not hearing things. Memory can be a little rough, but it's all of your attention is completely gripped and focused on a certain thing. And if we think about our day-to-day lives as almost like a full, or maybe more pointed circumstantially, between driving and working out and eating and whatever, what happens when we enter into these kind of conflict areas is that window starts to close a little bit. We want to avoid tunnel vision, where we only see one thing and we lose all sense of perspective on what's going on around us. We might call that, what's the trendy word? Situational awareness. That was super trendy 10 years ago. So we don't want to become tunnel vision, but we don't want to lose sight of what information is important to us right now. And that's where the evaluation comes in. The role of a leader and the responsibility of leaders when it comes to the dissemination of information is by identifying what is important and most important to the success of the mission and the health of the men, and to communicate that to them in an effective way. And so if we're looking at 2024, it's another election year, already showing the rumblings of another summer of love trying to come out of the woodwork. We've already had multiple attempts at creating a George Floyd situation. We've already seen these protests/riots at schools creating a lot of social attention. It's already a contentious year. There is no way that this election is going to not be contentious. So because of all these factors going on, I wanted to make sure that you had some of this information as we start reflecting on lessons learned from the 2020 Summer of Love. And today's conversation was communication. I suggest you get together your people who you're going to communicate to and set up a red line and a black line on an app where you can add members and remove members if people become unstable and they're incapable of being effective members of the team, but that you have some control over it. And then you have your red line, which is purely for emergencies, and you have your black line, which is a little bit more for communications, particularly focused on of reporting and evaluating information, which doubles as a method of dissemination, knowing that you can reserve that red line for extreme circumstances. The lessons learned from 2020 and now going into 2021, living in Minneapolis at the time, are once again back to front and center with 2024 on our hands. And so just remember, the evaluation of information is different than access to information. And it is just as important for you today to become better at evaluating information, because you're not likely going to find yourself in a situation where our access to information is gone. The attempts at totalitarianism in that field will most likely fail. That being the case, this has been the Redacted Culturecast. If you want to support our show, you can head over to redactedllc.com, or if you want to check out Obsidian Arms and you're building out that kit, go to obsidianarms at obsidianarms.com. But for this, I thank you, and now go forth and conquer.